Welcome. In this briefing, we're going to analyze the command decisions that led to the Vizcaya campaign. Our focus will be on the strategic thinking that shifted the main effort of the Spanish Civil War to the Northern Front in the spring of 1937.
All the information presented here is drawn directly from the meticulous research of the Batallas Guerra Civil project, which was authored by Spanish Army Cavalry Colonel F. J. Victor Rodrigo.
All right, here's our agenda. We'll start with the strategic context. Then we'll walk through the evaluation of different fronts, zero in on the target selection, detail the final plan, assess the risks, and wrap up with a look at the defender's situation.
Okay, let's get right into it. We're starting with the strategic situation in late March 1937. The entire landscape of the war has just fundamentally shifted. You see, the failure of the nationalist offensive at Guadalajara was a massive turning point. That initial idea of a quick war that ends with taking Madrid? That was off the table. This forced a complete strategic rethink. Everyone knew this was going to be a long war now. And because of that, a new decisive objective was needed. And it was needed urgently to regain the initiative and boost morale.
So, let's move on to the analysis of the different fronts. With Madrid no longer the main goal, the High Command had to look at every possible theater of operations to decide where to focus their main effort.
Well, two options were discarded pretty quickly. First, Aragon. The enemy there was just considered too strong to get a decisive breakthrough with the forces they had available. Then you had Andalusia. That was seen as an eccentric theater. Basically, it was off the main strategic axis and didn't have any major objectives. And that was really highlighted by the recent failed offensive at Pozoblanco. So neither of these fronts was going to deliver that decisive victory they were looking for.
And that process of elimination left the Northern Front. Now, this is what made the North so attractive. It was an isolated pocket of enemy territory. It was politically fragmented, militarily divided. There was no real unified command. But most importantly, conquering it meant getting control of huge human and industrial resources. The kind of resources essential for fighting a long war. It was, without a doubt, the most favorable strategic option.
So they selected the Northern Theater. But now they had a new problem. Where exactly to strike? The front was way too big, and they didn't have enough forces to operate across the whole thing at once. They had to pick a specific objective.
And as you can see on this map, there were really three main options: Asturias, Santander, or Vizcaya. The basic principle of concentrating your force meant they could only really go after one of them as the main effort. The thinking was that the toughest resistance would come at the two ends of the front, Asturias and Vizcaya.
When you compare them, the choice becomes pretty clear. An attack on Asturias would be incredibly difficult. You're talking about rugged geography and fighters who had already proven how tough they were. For now, that front was considered contained. Vizcaya, on the other hand, had more favorable terrain, and the enemy's resolve was thought to be weaker. But here's the kicker. It was the industrial heart of the entire region. Capturing it wouldn't just bring huge economic gains, it would send shockwaves internationally.
Now, an interesting question comes up. Why not just attack the weakest point, Santander? Well, the answer comes down to the strategic goal. Yeah, tactically it would have been easier, but taking Santander would split the Northern Front without actually ending the campaign there. You'd still have the two main centers of gravity, Asturias and Vizcaya, holding out. So the decision was made to go for a decisive blow, not just an easy one. Vizcaya was the target.
Okay, the objective has been selected. Let's now dig into the formal decision and the operational plan that came from it.
The decision became official on March 21st. The next day, General Muala was ordered to carry out the operation. And this decision, it really marks a critical shift in the war. The time for limited maneuvers was over. What was being assembled now was a modern war machine, built for a total war of attrition and industrial power.
Before we look at the plan, we have to understand the battlefield. The military topography here in Vizcaya is defined by mountains. This creates a kind of transverse compartmentalization that is really good for the defender. The only real ways to penetrate are along the river valleys, especially the Nervión and the Ibaizábal, which all lead toward the ultimate prize, Bilbao. The actual operational concept was laid out in a reserved instruction from General Mola months earlier, back on January 26th. It called for a multi-pronged invasion. And as you can see from the map, the plan was to grab the critical communications hub of Durango first. That would be the first major objective, and it would set the stage for the final push on Bilbao.
The plan laid out four distinct axes of advance. You had three main thrusts. one from the east through Vergara to Durango, another from the southeast through Villarreal to Lamona, and a third from the south through Orduña. Then there was a fourth, secondary access along the coast. This was designed as a flanking move to threaten the enemy's rear and really stretch out their defenses.
Now let's turn to the staff's assessment. Any good operational plan comes with a thorough analysis of the risks, and the Vizcaya offensive was no exception. It was evaluated meticulously.
A staff study written by Lieutenant Colonel Barroso assessed the whole operation. He absolutely understood how decisive it was. Success or failure in the north could very well decide the outcome of the entire war. His study pointed out significant risks and laid out some very clear requirements for success.
Let's focus on the key conditions they identified. The staff fully expected the enemy to bring in reinforcements, which meant they needed absolute firepower superiority to break through fortified lines. They also expected diversionary attacks on other fronts, which had been stripped of troops to support this one. So success really hinged on achieving overwhelming local superiority by concentrating their forces and then executing the plan with as much speed and tactical surprise as possible.
And this really shows the shift in doctrine. As Lieutenant Colonel Barroso himself put it, 50% of the operation's success depended on the correct use of this weapon. And he was talking about a massive, well-directed concentration of artillery. This was going to be a battle of firepower, not just maneuver.
Finally, let's wrap this up by looking at the strategic situation from the other side, from the defender's perspective. What was Vizcaya's actual capacity to resist an offensive like this?
You see, a successful defense of Vizcaya depended on three critical conditions being met. But the reality was, because of its profound strategic and political isolation, it was highly unlikely that any of those conditions could actually be fulfilled.
Let's just break down these fatal weaknesses. First, there was no unity of command. Political divisions just prevented any kind of real military cohesion across the northern front. Second, external aid was basically impossible. A naval blockade and air superiority meant it was almost totally isolated. And third, there was no plan for any large-scale supporting offensives on other fronts. People used to say the defense of the North had to happen outside the North, but the Republican command just wasn't capable of pulling off that kind of coordinated strategy.
In the end, Vizcaya was alone. Its fate was sealed long before the first shot was ever fired. This concludes our strategic briefing. For a more detailed, granular analysis of the operational phases of this campaign, you should consult the source material at batallasguerracivil.es.